Hello, everybody. It's Heather with the Leadership with Heart podcast. And I am super thrilled for the long-awaited interview with Susan Schmitt Winchester. She was referred to me by somebody who interviewed me for an article. And she was like, oh my gosh, you two have so much in common. Like, you completely need to be talking to each other. She's got a new book out and just all kinds of cool things. And so I'm excited to have you on the show, Susan.
Well, Heather, it's a pleasure. You've got an amazing book as well, and I'm really glad we've been connected.
Oh, it's going to be cool. Okay, so where are you? Tell everybody, where are you right now in your leadership journey?
Where am I on my leadership journey? So from a corporate standpoint, coming up on nearly 34 years as an HR leader, and the opportunity to work in 3 Fortune 500 companies. I'm currently the head of HR for a Fortune 200. Before that, a Fortune 500 head of HR. And the leadership journey is a continuous journey of learning and discovery. Both through my own experiences as well as having the privilege to work with so many amazing leaders and executives in the companies that I serve. And the leadership journey is a continuous process. As you know, I love your whole approach, which is how do you grow and become a more caring and empathetic leader, especially in a time like what we're facing these days. So I think in the last couple of years for me personally, I've had more growth in terms of how to show up in my career than I had previously. And one of the concepts that my co-author Martha and I talk about in our new book is the fact that many of us, me included, for 30 of those 34 years, was living what I call the unconscious wounded career path, where we're unaware of how much our past childhoods or dysfunctional experiences we had are actually impacting us in the workplace in ways that can be pretty devastating. And so I'm happy to say on my own journey, realizing that we have a choice, we don't have to be on the unconscious wounded career path. We can actually choose the conscious healing career path, is a much better place to be. And so that's been my probably my biggest growth moment here in the last few years in the work with Martha to create the book, Healing at Work, literally using the workplace as a laboratory for emotional healing.
I love that so much. And it's so funny because as I think about that, I'm knee deep in this work, right, too. But thinking about how folks are really reluctant to do that kind of work, that kind of stuff at work, right? It's like it doesn't belong at work. And I talk a lot about whole person leadership. And I feel like, meeting people in those spaces is so important. And people are just really uncomfortable. And I think what I've come to find out is that it has so much to do with our filter and our history, our background, how we were raised. When we think about the folks that are uncomfortable with dealing with this at work, oftentimes if like our parents didn't talk about these things with us, then we kind of pull that forward. We don't talk about stuff with our kids. We don't talk about stuff with our husbands. We go to work. We don't talk about stuff with our team members. We just continue the cycle. And I love your concept. I mean, I talk about this idea too, but this choice concept is so powerful, isn't it? It really does give power back to us. We don't have to ask permission to show up that way. We just get to make the choice to say, I'm going to be an active participant in this healing. So I love that concept.
I love it too. And I also like the fact that, we can be working on ourselves in the workplace without anybody knowing it. And, so the reality is that when we deal with conflict at work, what Martha and I call bumper car moments, when we come crashing into one another, like, back in the old days in the amusement park, riding along in your bumper car, happy, smiling, laughing, this is great. And then all of a sudden somebody crashes into you unexpectedly and your head's, shaking. And the opportunity in those moments in the workplace is to start to learn how to manage our old triggers. For me, I get triggered if I feel like I'm being judged or criticized or left out. There's a variety of different things that can happen at work that immediately launch me into my old limiting beliefs. And I know you and I share a limiting belief when I read your story about your upbringing and some of the realities of your grandma not putting pictures of you up in the house. I mean, just reading that chapter breaks my heart. But the reality is that you walked away and I walked away with an understanding or a broken belief that somehow we weren't good enough. And when that gets triggered in the workplace, particularly in these conflict moments, it can launch us into all kinds of reactive behavior that's really a result of that old wound that we don't even realize is playing out in the middle of that conflict. And so the opportunity is to become conscious of that. Conscious leadership, I know that's a concept that's really key. Personal leadership is recognizing when we've been triggered, recognizing those old limiting beliefs that come up, recognize that it's going to typically launch us into an outdated script of how we're supposed to behave. For me, it's people pleasing and perfectionism. For other people, it could be bully. I mean, there's a whole host of behaviors we pick to
Hmm.
try to protect ourselves, and becoming conscious in the moment to say, hey, I have a different choice here. I don't have to respond. I don't have to jump into these old behaviors that can be quite dysfunctional in and of themselves.
Yeah.
So that's the opportunity. And I don't have to tell you, my colleague, what I'm working on, but I can use those moments because they happen all the time at work as practice, like a practice playground relative to how I'm going to respond differently in much
Yeah,
more.
that's a very good point. I like that. I like that. And I'm looking at it from like the leadership lens and saying when you can recognize in someone like the tide of emotion is changing, or like the sentiment or the energy level in the work that your team members are putting forth has changed. When you
Mhm.
sense it, most people aren't super comfortable going there. They either rather ignore it, they
True.
rather, they just do other things. And I'm saying, the whole person idea is, yes, you individually can be working on things at work, but if I, as the leader, sense something's going on, I think it's incumbent upon me to go there, to
That's great.
go a little deeper, to engage. And they may or may not feel comfortable going
Yep.
there, and I'm not going to force the issue, but I need them to know I'm there for
Yeah,
them
I
in
love
the
it.
moment to help them in any way possible with resources or listening or whatever that is. And so that's what I'm talking about. But I agree
No,
with you.
you're right. I love it.
Yeah.
That's a really important point, is that if we're responsible for a team and we feel like somebody's not themselves, they're off, something's not happening, I completely agree that that's the leader's responsibility to step in and at least be there for them.
What is I'm curious to know what your drive to lead comes from. You've been working in this industry and then working with this company, right? And for a long time. And so, where does your drive to lead come from?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think probably, growing up in a family, my dad was a minister and was very active in the community. So I learned early on, I thought it was normal that everybody had 300 family members. I didn't really realize that I was special. But I had an opportunity to watch him shape and play a key role in the community. And also my mom was doing the same thing. So I think that drive to serve, that drive to, be able to meet anybody where they are, no matter what level in the company they are, every single level matters. And I think that desire to play a part that's going to make a difference for something bigger than me. So, having the opportunity to be in the corporate world gives me the opportunity to shape the lives of every single person and their families that are impacted by their experience in the company. And that drives me, that desire to help leaders and executives and others in the company be who they want to be, playing a role of service and support to try to help people be the best they can be in the workplace, which creates a healthier culture. It also creates healthier family systems. And so that's what drives me, is that feeling like I've made a difference for somebody's some challenges in the workplace. Um, I feel very rewarded to be able to be in a position to make a difference in that way. That drives
Mm,
me.
it's interesting. I think as we go back to that idea of not feeling good enough, the wound that you talk about, right? Not feeling good enough. I often wonder if that wound of mine, I always talk about, my TED talk was transforming adversity into opportunity. So for me, I like everything's all about how
Yeah,
all of these things created opportunities that I chose to seize, and it show up as a different person that I wanted to
I
be,
love it.
right?
Yeah.
But what I think about you when you're saying, like, my drive is to help people be all they can be, to make sure that people know that they're important, like those kinds of concepts. I do think it stems from the wound. I think it's the good that stems from
Oh,
the wound, right? Because it's
love it.
like,
Yes.
I didn't feel like I mattered. I didn't feel like I was important, but I want other people to feel important. I want other people, all
Yeah.
those things that I didn't feel, I want them to feel it. And you're
I,
right. The response could be totally different. It could be like, I didn't feel it. Now you're not going to feel it. Like I could be like a total jerk, or I didn't feel it. And in our cases, but I want you to be one who does feel that, and it's just amazing the amount of power that comes from that.
that's very perceptive. I agree with you that the underlying belief that I took away from my childhood, I don't think my parents intended me to walk away from my childhood with that belief, but it was that something wasn't, that I wasn't enough. has probably fueled my desire to help people feel like they're enough. I never really connected that dot before, so thank you.
People always say when they leave my show, it feels like there was a therapy session. I'm not really, it's not purposeful. I see it. I want to mention it. And it's a learning. Like I said, I learn, you learn, I just learn more about me. And I think we can just learn. So I love it. I think it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay. So then what would people, the folks that you have, that have reported to you over the years, what would they say then about your leadership style? Who are
Well,
you as a leader?
I think it's evolved. So I think, if I think back when I was on that unconscious wounded career path, I was driven. I believed that it was my job to prove myself constantly to my bosses. And if something happens in the team that would take away from, how I was viewed by somebody in authority, because I had this belief that it was their job to determine my worth, and my job was to prove to them I was worthy. So it was a really broken way of thinking. And as a result of that, I think about the consequences. I was probably pretty hard on my team in moments where I felt like that was being threatened. If somehow the perception of my manager was going to be negatively impacted because of something that was happening in the team. So I think, that being the people pleaser perfectionist on the unconscious path of trying to get that approval was also leading me to set unrealistic expectations of myself and my team. Never saying no. That's not necessarily healthy. Having a high sense of urgency on everything. Everything's the most important thing. And probably because I was judging myself harshly, constantly beating myself up at night, I'm sure my team felt judged and frustrated. I think there were good things about my leadership back then on the unconscious path too. I have high energy. I care about people. I'm sure they would describe that. But I can look back now and say, man, I wish I could redo a number of those years and not be coming from that place of so much neediness. And the impact on myself and my team, I'm sure, was felt. But now moving into that conscious healing career path, I think I'm much less reactive. I'm less likely to interpret things that go wrong at work through the old lens, and much more able to stay grounded on, okay, what's happening right now? I'm having a triggered response. I need to go process that myself. That's my responsibility, not to process it or, to have negative reactions with my team. So I think they would say, high energy. They would still say that, results oriented, but fairly grounded. I hope they would say that. And generally, no matter what happens, to me, it's just like, well, we're going to manage it. Whatever's happening is going to be manageable. We'll get through it. Rather than having those old responses thinking, uh-oh, my manager's going to think I'm not effective, and going into all the fear-based responses. So that's what I hope they would say. I think my team today well, they don't know me from before. But if I step back with my former team in my last company, I think that they may see some difference.
Wow, that's powerful. It's powerful for me because, of course, I believe in personal transformation, and I believe that it starts with an awareness and then a choice to do something about it. So, as I hear, you think about that journey idea, I mean, it's so exciting and interesting to see where you go these next, several years, right? With how the leadership style changes, and the same with me. I think about, I don't know if you know anything about the DISC assessment, but you probably have done it in HR. You know about it, and so many years ago, before I had kids, I was this like high DI, so just like driven. The people balance is the only thing that kept me where people didn't go so nuts being around me, because I had that high I, right? But then after I had kids, I went down, I was like, still high I, my D went below the energy line, and now my S goes above the energy line, because it's like team and cohesiveness and like all of that stuff, right? So how I show up, I was like rah, rah, rah team before, and now it's like, I'm so rah, rah, but now I'm like rah, rah, and it's all like, let's come closer. And like, so the level of engagement over these last 20 years, whatever, has just been totally different than what it was before. It was more focused on me before, and driving and achieving. And I still like to achieve. I'm an achiever. But on top of that, now there's achieve together. And do we need to stop and go back and take you in before we do that? Do we need to do something for you before we do that? So I'm more considerate.
I think it's really fantastic that the having 4 kids, which amazing, changed you as a leader in terms of from the self to other orientation. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Well, they say like those things don't change unless they're like major life change. And I'm thinking, well, I'm an only child, and having 4 kids is a kind of a major life change. So
That's amazing. You should be commended for that.
Oh my gosh, we try hard. I wish I could say we're perfect at it, but none of us are, right? So,
Oh, that is for
um,
sure.
okay, so recall, I want you to, this is the kind of the turning point in the conversation where I want you to recall a time, kind of a specific story you can walk everybody through where maybe you weren't the best leader, the leader with heart, the caring leader. And what did you do to come out of it?
Yeah, I have a very distinct moment in my memory from my career. This was back 20-ish years ago, and I had just taken my first big vice president job. I was the head of HR for a $4 billion business unit, and I was entering into the team. It was myself and 9 men, and they were from different parts of the world: British, New Zealander, let's see, Canadian, American. And the person that was in the role before me wasn't with that team long, and then she left the company. It wasn't really clear what happened. And I don't think they had a lot of respect for HR. So I walked into the situation, and honestly, for the first, 9 or 10 months, I was completely triggered by not being good enough, feeling like I wasn't adding value, I wasn't being accepted. I remember my first meeting with this team, it was a 4-hour meeting, and the president had everybody going around and doing their updates. And at the end, there were about 30 minutes left. He said, "Does anyone else have any other updates?" And I said, "Well, I've got some really important HR things to share with you." And I'll never forget one of my colleagues standing up, looking at me, slamming his notebook shut, and walking out of the room. I went home and cried. I thought, I got to get my resume updated. This is terrible. These guys are, you talk about totally being triggered for a perfectionist and people pleaser. All my old strategies that had worked for me up until this point in my career were completely backfiring. The harder I tried to show them my value, the more it pushed them away. And I was very, very, very lucky that I had an executive coach, an amazing executive coach, and she had me do an exercise that completely changed my view of the situation. Because I was in definite victim, beating myself up at night, literally not in a good place, drinking too much Chardonnay to try to make myself feel less stressed. My good friend Chardonnay, we were spending way too much time together. And the exercise my coach took me through, her name, by the way, is Tony Lynn Chinoy. Like, she gets a lot of credit for here. She said, "I want you to pick of the 9 men, who are the worst?" And I picked 4 of them. and so she had me imagine uh, myself looking at them. What animal? She asked me what animal I would pick to represent them symbolically. I picked a gorilla, a grizzly bear, a wolf with long fangs, and a hyena. And then she said, "I want you to get into their eyes. And now you're in their eyes looking at you. What animal would they pick for you to represent you symbolically?" And I burst out laughing, and I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm a golden retriever puppy dog. I'm wagging my tail. I want them to pat me on the head and tell me what a good girl I am." And like those puppies that are super annoying because they want too much attention, I was irritating them. And then she laughed. She said, "Well, how's that puppy dog doing with those ferocious animals?" I said, "Not very well." They were literally, I was like sport. I felt like sport in this situation. And she said, "Well, who's that about?" Because of course I wanted to blame when you're interacting with them. You need to take on a different energy because your energy is causing this reaction. And so I thought it was very powerful. She helped me. I ended up picking a lioness. And I figured a lioness is strong, she's powerful, she'll fight when she needs to, but she won't fight, in most cases. And so with some good coaching support from Tony, I went in and approached each one of them with my lioness energy and started to take on the relationship, coming from a totally different place in my own leadership journey. And just one quick example, the grizzly bear never showed up for any meetings that I ever scheduled with him. And so one day, unannounced, I walked in, I sat down in his office, I sat in the chair, his back was to me, he was on his computer. He turned around, he was a big guy, turned around like growling, the grizzly bear, like, "What are you doing in my office?" And I said, "I realize you never show up for any meetings I schedule. And I'm just wondering, is it A, you're too busy, B, you don't like HR, or C, you don't like me personally?" And I just sat there. And my heart was racing, the butterflies were jumping up in my stomach, but I'm like, I'm a lioness, I'm a lioness, I'm a lioness. And he looked at me and he said, "You're right. I'll never do that again." And to the day he died, we were friends. But the message and the lesson, in where I wasn't showing up in my leadership, I was giving all of my power to them to decide if I was worthy. And it was a really bad situation. And in reality, it was 100% my responsibility to take back the responsibility for determining my worth. That was a key moment on my journey of where I wasn't a good leader.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can think about, yeah, I would say I'm a recognition seeker too. So I'm a recognition giver and a recognition seeker, although it's gotten different again, as I get older. And of course the kids are so much the focus, I require
Mhm.
less of it, but I still need the dopamine boost. Like that's how I get a main source of dopamine is still that way.
Yep.
Um, so I try to find other ways like working out and other things, right? Where you're getting all the oxytocin and just the good stuff, right? Hugs but as I think through that, that was some of the stuff I wasn't doing really necessarily the golden retriever part, but the idea of don't you see my value, and that kind of thing was like almost when it wasn't going well, it'd be like in my mind I'd be as an entitlement idea, and
Mhm.
it was like
I know.
what
I did the same
that
thing.
kind of thing. And so it was just, I remember like in the times
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it wasn't every time, but I would say, yeah, that would be, and the other thing is when we were thinking about the triggers, whenever I felt, still to this day, but when I would feel someone moving me, like taking their finger and going, you go there. And I'd be like, you're
Yeah.
limiting where I'm going to go. Like it would just like that in my mind, it would just throw me up, right? And it's
Yeah.
just because it's like, I'm like, my value's bigger than that. Why am I only going there in my mind? Right.
Mhm.
So, and then it's funny how you act out in those situations. Yeah,
Oh,
grown
absolutely.
adults but it's I think it relates back to those like wounds as you talked about.
No question about it. There's no question about it. I was so triggered. I felt so unimportant, so much an outsider. And I was completely clueless to even thinking about my past growing up with my dad, although he was a minister, he had some pretty profound issues with rage, and not even conscious to how much that experience shaped my reactions in my career. That's that unconscious wounded career path I talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And the response of trying to manage the emotion of not being good enough in our career leads many to use unhealthy habits for self-soothing. The addictions, the many overachievers, including myself, had turned to things like that to make themselves feel better. And it's interesting too. I was thinking about something else you said earlier. As a leader, when we were talking earlier, it's our responsibility to be aware of what's happening in our teams and how our teams are doing. There's research that shows that 2/3 of adults, nearly 2/3, experience some negative, it's called the adverse childhood experiences in their childhood. And these are 10 really pretty severe things that can happen. 2/3 of us walking the halls of the corporate world are coming into the workplace with these wounds that we aren't even really aware of how much it's affecting us in our interactions with people. I was totally in that story with those men. I was so triggered with my limiting beliefs of being unworthy and not good enough and not deserving to be on that team. It fueled ridiculous workaholism. It fueled complete focus on trying to get that validation from that team at the expense of my relationship with my sons and my ex-husband. And again, all unconsciously,
Mm-hmm.
that's the piece that I'm so passionate about now, is trying to help people realize you don't have to live your career that way. You can still have amazing accomplishments without all the negative costs of that dysfunctional wounded path.
Mm.
That's what's fueling me now.
Oh, I love that so much. Okay, so now it's time for you get to actually turn the tables and ask me a question.
Oh, all
So it's like
right,
now you're the
excellent.
interviewer.
I
So
love it.
what question do you have for me?
Oh, I first of all, I just admire you so much, and your book is amazing. And I would like you to talk a little bit about, where do you get your inspiration from now as you continue your passionate work? and your desire to change how people are treated in the workplace. There's one quote you have, I can't remember it exactly, but that if you truly want to be successful as a business, you have to care about your people. And so what keeps you driven? What keeps you motivated now?
I think it's an inward and an outward focused. I kind of alluded to this earlier that there's no doubt I have an ego. So like, I wouldn't even be where I'm at if I had no ego. So my ego drives me to a certain extent, meaning, I want to continue to achieve. I want to continue to have impact. I want to continue to have a legacy. And so that's one thing. I am deeply, deeply driven by making people feel like they are important, like they have value to me and to those who are important to them, because I didn't as a child. So it just, like I said, it stems from that. But for me, it's a good thing. That wound is the thing that produces this amazing relatability with people. So it's a gift and a blessing. And so I don't take that for granted in the least bit. When I sense that I might be doing that because I have the ability to do that, I have the desire. One of my big strengths is woo. So I have empathy and relator, and then I have woo. And so woo is that sells, kind of like always selling, always pitching. So I get super sensitive because I get super sensitive to the part when I feel myself, maybe I can get on the manipulative side. And so I have to, for me, because I'm hyper aware, that's a big strength of mine, I just kind of back myself up and I just focus on the other person and say, yeah, yep, you have the ego. Yes, you have the desire to drive to win. But in the end, it really is driven by this thing that it's so important to me that people walk away with that. And then they feel that the connection with me is real, that I'm giving them the time and attention. And then I hope to pass that ability over to other people who might not automatically have that as the starting point because they maybe didn't have the wounds I have, which means they don't have the drive I have to be that person. But the ones who really do have that drive, they want to be more that way. I'm excited to be able to pass that to them to help them lead a legacy.
How do you handle setbacks? When you think about you've put yourself out there, you've written a book, you're very visible, you're a thought leader. It's normal when you're out there putting yourself out there that you're going to get, not you personally, but generally negative feedback from people that have a negative response. How do you handle those moments?
I don't love them. Actually, the worst part is when I don't get any feedback. So remember I told you I'm like feedback seeking, which if you think about this, the whole focus of my organization, Employee Fanatics, is to create cultures of listening. So listening is bi-directional. It's a constant like feedback loop, right? I'm always highlighting that, or that's what we do in the work we do, is all about highlighting feedback to team members and actually what it gives them and then what it produces for the organization. So for me, it's that same thing. It's like if I don't get feedback from something, I don't even really care if it's not good. It's the no feedback actually that's worse for me. So when silence happens, I'm so not comfortable with that. It's when they give me like, Heather, here's the thing I do improve next time. Awesome. You know why I like that? Because now I got to go now because I'm an achiever. There's something I can do about it. It gives me something I can do, right? Versus, oh my gosh, there's silence. Was I great? Was I horrible? Or whatever it is, right? Were we great? Did our performance, whatever. So that's kind of how I am. It's the silence that's the worst. Other than that, setbacks to me are like, when it's coupled with silence, it's harder. If it's setbacks with feedback, I am like, let's go do this. Let's totally go do this. I'm human. And partly I think about this too, because there was one time, there was a very interesting that happened to me. It would have been somewhere in my 20s. And I received a letter from a friend and it was kind of damning, let's just say.
Oh.
And I read it and I read it and I read it. I mean, that thing I had to, at some point, my husband's like, you need to burn it. Seriously. You read it about time, burn it. Seriously. Because it's like you're taking in too much. But what I learned in that moment related to feedback is we have to take in any situation, the grains of truth. There is a grain of truth in almost any feedback. There's a grain of truth, and we have to take the grain and throw the rest away instead of like, hammering in all the negativity and all that stuff. So I learned that now, that when someone gives me feedback, I'm like, let me reason this through. Let me take some time. Where's the truth here? Because there's truth here. And everybody listening, listen, I don't even care if it's from your enemy. There's actually a piece of truth there.
I agree.
And you got to find the truth. That's the only way we get better.
I love it.
Right? And so it's like, even if it's like that, who'd you get, the grizzly bear guy?
Yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah.
It's like, he's like total ass, whatever it is. And you're just like, but wait, what's here? What's actually here? What's here? What's the seed? What's the kernel? And then get rid of the rest. And so, there you go. Those are great questions.
You were so cute telling that story. No, that's great. I'm curious too with the work you're doing with companies, with the lessons you're teaching in your book. What are you seeing from companies and their response to the idea of more caring leadership? That was something else I was really intrigued by.
Yeah. We're just kind of getting started on the journey of the company pitch, like the company, their companies are obviously bringing them in. What I have found is that healthcare companies are the ones that are most connected to my message, which makes sense. Healthcare companies, because their whole focus is caring for
Yeah.
patients, right? So I think the organizations that already have an affinity or a mission on love or connection or like those kinds of things are
Mhm.
going to be drawn to the work I do. I would say probably the ones I'll probably there could be some that'll be going like kicking and screaming if we go in and start training them. If they're, for example, have like field work, like manufacturing, oil and gas, like that. So I have a company that was my very first client that I had for many years, and I didn't have the caring leadership book, but my first book is the 7 Intuitive Laws of Employee Loyalty. So all of my training and anything I would do would be around concepts inside there, right?
Mhm.
And it was oil and gas, and I got to tell you, I think it's because I'm so relatable. No matter what my credentials are, it's the relatable part, which I say it's a blessing and a gift for sure. But I
Mhm.
would go to these people who would have the hard hats, the boots, like they were like, yes, ma'am," like that's how they talk to me, right? And they would take it in, and they would be like, "Wow, like number one, I'm so surprised you're training us, just like little old us on the front line." So that
Mhm.
would be many of their initial thing, like, I can't believe you're talking to us about communicating effectively. And I'd be like, "You're a human, right? And you talk to other humans? Okay, well then I think you need this training." And they were like, they thought it was funny. So we just would have fun with each other. And so we can people can become more receptive, but it depends on, we just need to make sure we're speaking their language, we're coming to them in their way. And it starts with the leaders. So if the leaders are like, this is hogwash, this is smushy swishy kind of
Yeah.
thing,
No,
then
I truly think you are onto something big though, because the war on talent has never been what it is now. And the talent supply of the past does not equal the talent supply of the future. And so when I was thinking about you preparing for today and obviously learning about your book and reading your book, the companies I think that are going to do what you're teaching are going to be the ones that are differentiated in the talent market, because people want to work for companies where they feel like the company cares about them. They feel like no matter who they are, no matter where they are in the world, that they believe that the company stands for being good to their people. And so I think that so many companies are just challenged by the quarterly earnings releases and making sure we're meeting the expectations of our shareholders. And it's obviously key for companies, public companies, and it has to be an and statement. And what are we doing to make sure we're taking care of our people? So I think you're onto something big. And I think companies that want to differentiate themselves in the market are going to be looking to thought leaders like you to help them find ways to do that more effectively. I think there are lots of companies doing lots of great things, but really intentional work like what you're teaching, I think is a huge opportunity.
I appreciate that. Yeah, you know what? It's from the heart. We're trying, and we're going to evangelize and keep spreading. Like that seed's going to go all over the place. So
Love it.
that's the focus here. So it's
So
awesome.
congratulations. Like I said, you're onto something. I think you're going to get more and more popular as you continue this work.
Oh, thanks, Susan. That's awesome. Okay, question for you now. For
Yeah.
those who are listening, if they need some extra motivation, which I think you've given them quite a bit. I think between the two of us, there's been like so much like good stuff here, right? But when you think about like the pearls of wisdom, maybe like one or two things you might leave people with, those final thoughts. Like, I want to be a better leader. I want to, make sure that I'm leading with heart. I want to make sure, I want whatever. What is that? What are those pearls of wisdom you leave them with?
Oh, pearls of wisdom. Well, first of all, I think it's one pearl of wisdom is realizing that the workplace does create an opportunity for emotional healing through bumper car moments, the conflicts, is realizing that many of us are on an unconscious wounded career path and we have a choice to make a different career path for ourselves. That's one thing. Secondly, as leaders, realizing that 2/3 of adults have grown up with some significantly negative adverse childhood experience. And while we're not therapists, and I'm not suggesting we try to be therapists, it does help us understand more about why people may be showing up the way they're showing up at work. In fact, I can't help but mention Oprah Winfrey's new book with Dr. Bruce Perry, What Happened to You? It's really all about, rather than looking at people that we work with and judging, well, why are they doing that? What's wrong with them? Talk about is asking the question, I wonder what happened to them. because we're all shaped by our past. And so having more compassion and empathy towards the people we're working with, even those that we are, having the greatest difficulty with, there's a story behind the behavior. There always is. So those would
Mm.
be the words of wisdom I would leave the audience with.
Powerful, powerful, powerful. I love that. It's just, yes. I'm geeking out. This is the geek out moment. This is why I do this show.
I love it. This is
Oh
great.
my gosh. So for those who are listening, if you've gotten a lot of value with from my conversation with Susan, please do share it far and wide. It makes a huge difference and it continues to let the podcast move up the algorithms, right? And don't forget to write that 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. And Susan, thank you so much. I'm glad it took a long time for us to get here, but I'm so glad we did.
Me too. It was a pleasure. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to meet
Uh,
you.
Thank you everybody too for listening to the Leadership Heart podcast. Be well.